to Energy Vista, a podcast on energy issues, personal and professional trajectories. I'm your host, Leslie Palti-Guzman. In each episode of this podcast, we chat with energy experts from all around the world. We exchange on timely energy issues as well on their life experience. You will learn a lot whether you're an energy aficionado or a newbie. It's April 24, 2020, and time for a new Energy Vista episode. Today I'm exchanging with Benjamin Schmitt, a postdoctoral research fellow and project development scientist at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, where he focuses on the development of instrumentation and infrastructure for next-generation experimental cosmology facilities at the South Pole. Benjamin has also served as European Energy Security Advisor at the US Department of State. And this is when, in this position, that we crossed paths, notably at a couple of events on energy and geopolitics. Benjamin has also recently published a paper for the Center for European Energy Policy Analysis, CEPA, looking at the impact of COVID-19, low oil and gas prices on Russian energy vision and transatlantic relations. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Leslie.
So I'm not going to pretend to understand everything that you're doing or did in the past, especially when it comes to physics and astrophysics. But we'll get to that towards the second half of the podcast when you will tell us more about your personal and professional trajectory. And in the meantime, we'll focus on something that I know more, which is European energy security. So for several years now, my view has been that the more we delay Nord Stream 2 pipeline, the more the pipeline has been delayed, the least high are the odds of materialization for the pipeline. So do you think the delay until you kill it strategy has worked so far? And give us a little bit, what's the latest status on the pipeline?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, just to go back to your opener on physics and geopolitics of energy, I think my argument is going to be, but maybe by the end of this episode, that the two are not mutually exclusive. I think they're very much interconnected, and we can get to what that means in a minute. But opening up on Nord Stream 2, I think that we really dodged a major bullet at the opening of 2020 in terms of a major gas crisis in Europe. Because if we look back at kind of maybe some of those events that you and I attended in Washington over the past 5 or 6 years, there's really been two key pillars that have helped U.S. and European policymakers understand the Kremlin's energy playbook. First is the idea that the Russian Federation uses its oil reserves to generate state revenues, and its gas for political leverage and malign influence. That's number one. And then number two is that the beginning of 2020 probably would feature a widespread gas crisis in Europe due to a Russian cutoff of the Ukrainian gas transmission system, or GTS, that would be precipitated by the completion of both Gazprom's proposed Nord Stream 2 pipeline through the Baltic Sea and its dual-lined Turk Stream pipeline in the Black Sea. So maybe I can just turn this around and ask you a quick question. Let's do a quick pop quiz, if you don't mind. Which year did the following events take place? Does that sound good for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
Great. Okay, so the question is, year 2009 or 2020. Here's three headlines. Number one, a hydrocarbon pipeline directed westward is cut off by the Kremlin for political purposes. Number two, a decline in oil price threatens the economic norms that underpin domestic political stability across the Russian Federation. And number three, the transatlantic community, emerging from crisis, reassesses its energy relationship with Moscow. What do you think, 2009 or 2020?
Well, both, no?
Absolutely. It was kind of a trick question from the outside. But
we have exchanged in the past, and I remember very vividly, I had asked you a question, and you had told me, well, I think it's still the same. Like, it seems that things have not that much changed, for the past 10 years. And me, myself, as a gas analyst, I've been writing things in 2011 about Nord Stream 2 that I can still write now.
Yeah, and I think that's right. There's been some certainly continuities, at least rhyming, of the 2 years. But if you look back, there's a lot of striking similarities. Russia in 2009 was over-reliant on hydrocarbon export revenues to support its economy. There was at that point a 60% decline in the price of oil compared to 2008, and that drove then Prime Minister Vladimir Putin to attempt to increase gas prices in Ukraine sharply, which led to a cost dispute, which you well know, between Gazprom and Ukraine's Naftogaz that resulted in that famous cutoff of the Ukrainian GTS for over 2 weeks back in January 2009. That had a gas supply shortage crisis that spread across nearly 20 European nations. Well, at the same time, there was geopolitical drivers for Putin. The cutoff placed pressure on Kyiv to end its bid for NATO accession and its broader Euro-Atlantic aspirations, viewed by Moscow as an unacceptable drift westward. So I think you really see these similarities, but the differences are with Nord Stream 2 not being completed, that really allowed for maybe a little bit more stabilization in the gas sector, and the Kremlin decided to do an oil cutoff instead of Belarus.
So, for several years, there has been looming threats of sanctions from the US on Nord Stream 2. Eventually, sanctions happened as potentially a last resort strategy to derail the construction of the pipeline. Is it going to work? What are the odds now of materialization for the pipeline?
Well, I think if you step back and look at what actually took place on a kind of a minute by minute basis in the back in December when the sanctions that you're referring to came into effect, I think they have worked. They've had that positive and immediate impact that they were designed to do. If you go back to some of the earlier sanctions that were discussed,
and just between parentheses, so those are very targeted sanctions.
Yeah, exactly. So in 2017, the Congress, Senate, and House passed on a widely bipartisan basis the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. That is a mouthful, but it goes by the name of CATSA, and that had Section 232, which was a maybe more unpalatable sanctions setup, where it would be more of a sectoral sanction on gas off-takers of the pipeline. That was a discretionary sanction. It ultimately didn't get used because what took place instead was this 2020 clause in the National Defense Authorization Act that allowed for limited technology-calibrated sanctions that would really have the effect of stopping the physical construction of the pipeline. And that's where science and engineering aspect of foreign policy comes into play, in stopping the actual physical construction without having this broader diplomatic fallout that might have taken place if there was a sectoral sanction.
So now that the world is coping with COVID-19, very low oil and gas prices, do you think Gazprom and the Kremlin will have sufficient budget to finance the remaining construction of the pipeline? And also in terms of technology, will they have the means to finalize the pipeline?
Yeah, well, and that's a great question, and I think the answer is probably yes, but there's a major delay associated with that. What happened after these sanctions came into place? It's really kind of rare, and I think you and I, watching the European energy security space, rarely see this. We talk about these pipelines for what, decade, years and years, whether they're pipelines that the Europeans support or oppose. This one took place, this sanctions action took place and came into force on December 20th. And in the hours leading up to it, Allseas' primary pipelay vessel, the Pioneering Spirit, was actually, you could watch online in the public ship tracking software, it was slowing down, and it suspended operations before the signing took place, or as the signing took place, and then in the days following exited the Baltic Sea. It was a pretty dramatic scene. So yeah, that's really where things took place to stop what's going on. And then your question of can it be completed eventually? I think the answer is possibly, but there's a lot of questions about that, both from a technology standpoint and a sanctions and legal standpoint.
And so the theory has been for a long time, either from the perspective of the European Commission or the US government, that the more the pipeline is delayed, the more European energy players, consumers have alternative gas supplies, notably LNG from the US, but not limited, especially now that the world is awash with gas supply. Alternative energy sources, also renewables and others, increase demand uncertainty when it comes to gas demand and environmental concerns that add up and may not justify a new big white elephant infrastructure project. Do you think the European kind of mood toward Nord Stream 2 has changed or will evolve in the coming months?
Well, I hope so. Let's face it. The Europeans are on a broadly, majority basis opposed to this project. This is something that between 17 and 20 nations in the transatlantic space, including the United States and Canada, have expressed severe concerns with or opposition to since its announcement. This is not something that has a large contingent of supporters in the European Union. It's really just Germany and Austria and to some extent the Netherlands, although they even have expressed some security concerns and concerns with impacts on Ukraine as well. So yeah, I think that's really that's a really good question, and let's see what happened right after this took place. The pipeline was stopped, and that allowed for a change in these negotiations between Gazprom and Naftogaz that we've been looking at for many years, with the long-term contract set to expire at the end of last year. And on New Year's Eve, Gazprom signed a fresh 5-year transit contract with Naftogaz, where in the deal, Gazprom also finally agreed to pay Naftogaz nearly $3 billion in required damages from the 2019 Stockholm Arbitration Tribunal ruling, which censured Gazprom for its failure to deliver gas transit volumes under that original 2009 contract that had that major cutoff a decade ago. So, it's really something where you can see that immediate and positive impact. In terms of white elephants, this project is, I've always said it's not, quote, not just a commercial deal, right? There may be some commercial incentives for gas firms to be involved in the project, but that doesn't mean that the project itself would be profitable. 2017 Sberbank report showed that these sort of projects, Turk Stream, Nord Stream, and of course out in the east, the Power of Siberia, would take decades to become profitable. So, you don't just build these sort of massive projects to do that unless there's a different motivation. And that motivation is geopolitical. It's a security impact on Ukraine. If you look at what has gone on, this idea that this is bringing in Nord Stream 2 significant new gas to quote unquote fill the gas import gap due to declines in Groningen. Even if you didn't have any of these pipelines, the existing pipeline infrastructure entering the EU from external sources already would fully cover an increase in demand, which is already questionable, especially in this environment, of an additional 110 BCMA to come into the market in the next 20 to 30 years. But what's more, the project is very clearly aimed at diverting gas that's already transiting Ukraine and bringing it through the Baltic and the Black Seas through these two projects. And so with Nord Stream 2 not being completed, you'll see this narrative from the Gazprom side. Yeah, yes, your EU still needs, quote unquote, needs this, quote unquote, new gas. But let's look at what's happening with Turk Stream already. Data released on April 2nd by Ukraine's gas transmission system operator illustrated the severity of its impact already. Compared to the first quarter of 2019, there's been an overall 70% decrease of gas volumes flowed from Russia via the Ukrainian gas transmission system to the Balkan region, and a 90% decrease at the interconnector between Ukraine and Romania at Orlovka, for gas that is, instead of going through Ukraine to that region, the same gas is simply being redirected to reach Bulgaria and onward via Turk Stream 2 and Turk Stream Line 2. And that shows what's going on. This is a geopolitical aimed project to both hurt Ukraine from an economic perspective and from a military security perspective, because there's a lot of this infrastructure that Gazprom still relies on to get its gas to market. And again, we're not trying to get rid of, quote unquote, get rid of this gas coming from Russia in general, but to redirect it. And, there's gas infrastructure right at the line of contact in Donbass that the Russian Federation, the Kremlin, relies on to get that gas to market in Europe. And should that be obviated, should that not be needed anymore because of these diversionary pipelines?
Yeah.
One could question, is that one less strategic deterrent? Not to say that the tanks roll tomorrow, but it's one less element in the calculus for Russian aggression in the region.
So, put very bluntly, why European policymakers or European consumers should care if the Ukrainian gas transit is being bypassed? with new pipelines like Turk Stream and Nord Stream?
I mean, the consumers should be concerned with their national security, full stop. And that is really what's at stake here. These are projects that are really directly tied to the stability of Ukraine, which the European Union, and the transatlantic community writ large is supportive of its future NATO aspirations, its Euro-Atlantic aspirations. And we have to keep that in mind, because without an energy secure Ukraine and a geopolitically destabilized Ukraine, would result. And that's a concern. And for all the market drivers in the world to build these large scale infrastructure projects when there's no real commercial incentive, aside from maybe asset swaps upstream in the Russian Federation for some of these firms. Famously, both OMV and Shell had asset swap agreements in the Russian Federation, and others, I believe Wintershall as well,
Yeah.
at the outset back in 2015. So it might be profitable to kind of trade these sort of assets for participation in these projects, but again, that's not helping the consumer in any market way.
So one of your roles as an advisor at the State Department was to explain better to Europeans, policymakers and academics and other key players why the U.S. is being involved in European energy security, and there has been a lot of misunderstanding lately. Especially the U.S. has been accused of seeking market share in an unfair way, notably by trying to force the European to abandon Nord Stream 2. Can you tell us a little bit more how you see U.S. involvement in European energy security?
Sure. It's pretty straightforward. It's based directly on our diplomatic engagement with our European partners and allies, and then their national security. Because without energy secure and therefore nationally secure partners and allies, both across NATO and our transatlantic community, at large, the U.S. and its partners and allies will have a much more difficult time addressing global challenges like we're in right now, and that's really something that we have to keep in mind. So this idea, is you've pointed out, the narrative out there that the interest that we've had in European energy security is kind of this mercantilist idea that we want to stop projects in order to, quote, get market share. That's absurd, for two reasons, really. Number one, historically, we've been supportive of Europe's energy diversification of sources, routes, and fuel types for decades, since at least the fall of the wall.
Yeah, way before the shale gas revolution, and
Absolutely, and right, we've only been an exporter for a couple of years.
Right, and before the US started exporting.
That's energy. Right. So that's number one, and number two is I think even more specific to what Nord Stream 2 and Turk Stream. This notion that we want to, quote, stop, the U.S. would stop these projects in order to seize this market share. It's a ridiculous idea, and if that were, let's just say, and it certainly wasn't, but let's just say that was my my policy advisement when I was in Washington, I should have been fired. I wasn't, but I should have been fired, and because it would be a terrible plan. Of course, that wasn't the plan, because with these projects stopped, right, there's no net market. So if Nord Stream 2 is stopped, which it is right now, there hasn't been this 55 billion cubic meter a year market that, one could have, U.S. exporters or any global exporter come in and, quote unquote, fill. That gas is still going through the Ukrainian gas transmission system and keeping that strategic balance of energy across Europe. So that's really, that's really where we're coming from.
Let me expand a little bit on this, because I think it's very important for listeners to understand, is that Nord Stream 2 was not meant for Russia to sell more gas to Europe. It was only meant to divert existing contractual obligation and to change the route, basically. Not using Ukraine, but using this new expansion of Nord Stream 2.
Yeah, and I think that you see that's kind of in the disinformation, malign influence sphere. Look, you have three narratives out there, or, at least two narratives out there. And I always, as a physicist, I look back at Herr Schrödinger, right? The Schrödinger's cat, this idea of quantum duality, right? Can two things hold at once? And this narrative kind of sits in different markets, right? So there's this narrative out there from the Kremlin that for domestic audiences these projects are purely about hurting Ukraine, right? Hurting our NATO's eastern flank countries by building them as diversionary pipeline to cut off the Ukrainian GTS. That's one. The second one is for kind of the European audiences that there's going to be this increase in gas demand, possibly, but you need these large scale pipelines to fill that, and that's obviously false for the reasons I pointed out, being diversionary and that there's no net market share. And then the third one is that and don't listen to the Americans because they're just trying to support their shale exports. Again, not true, right? I don't think you'll see any comments from shale producers in the U.S. about Nord Stream 2. I've never heard of one, frankly, and that's because they don't really look at it this way. Most of the gas that's been exported from the United States, at least up until the recent energy crisis, has gone to South America and China. They're just looking to supply the global market and be that stable backbone supplier. They don't direct these cargoes for political purposes or otherwise to go in any given to any given location.
Mm-hmm. Another argument that shows also that the U.S. is not solely interested in selling its LNG is, when it comes to geopolitics and international affairs, the position of the State Department and its role go much beyond gas trade and LNG trade. But also the US has not constrained domestic gas production elsewhere to keep resources underground so that it benefits US gas interests. I think the US has been encouraging Indian gas production.
Absolutely.
Gas production in the East Med. So they are, and they are potentially competitors, right? Because those countries will import less gas. You can see through different angles and perspective that it's not the sole purpose of of the State Department just to encourage U.S. gas exports. However, I think I understand that that there could have been a confusion because lately the US government has been using LNG in trade discussion. Some have received it better than others, but basically some governments have been encouraged to import more US LNG to reduce their trade deficit. So do you think there is a share of responsibility from the US government in this misunderstanding of why the US would promote its exports?
Well, I mean, I think you have to step back and remember that we don't have something in this country known as like America Prom, right? We don't have a nationalized hydrocarbon company. We don't have a ministry of oil, for example. And the extent to which, and you'll see it going on right now with the COVID-19 related energy crisis, the OPEC plus fallout, is that there really is a limited amount of impact that the federal government can have on energy prices or directing energy trade. That's pretty clear right now. One of the only recourses that the Department of Energy, for example, might have is to help by buying or leasing, buying resources to put in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, SPR, or leasing storage capacity for producers in the U.S. There really is a limited amount of capacity. That said, some of the rhetoric obviously is a bit more soaring than is based in either the market or technical realities, of course. But that's more of a sign of our political environment that we've been in for some years, rather than the reality of the market or the technical situation.
Earlier, you mentioned that for Russia, gas has been traditionally used to gain political influence, and oil has been used to refill the coffers of the Kremlin, more for revenues. So what kind of change do you see in this post-COVID-19 low oil and gas pricing environment world?
Yeah, I mean, I think you saw at the start of this year, in my view, motivated quite a bit by the preoccupation by the Kremlin of Vladimir Putin's personal succession plan, or personal in extension of his own power in the Russian Federation. That this pressure that Transneft then was directed to place on Belarus was in part to try to push Minsk and President Lukashenko to further integrate economically and politically with the Russian Federation. The idea at that point was to basically kind of merge into a confederation, Russia and Belarus, to some at least economic perspective, so that then Vladimir Putin could have kind of an excuse to rule over a joined, economically connected region, and therefore extend his rule for beyond his current term limits. This was thrown out in the past month or two. There was basically a decision to just kind of flout that whole direction and just go straight for a constitutional change in term limits, which seems to be the path. And part of the reason I think for that is that that Belarus was able to diversify its oil imports, so there wasn't as big a crisis as there could have been for purchases from Norway, and kind of in a major political statement, taking a Zeri oil crude over the Black Sea, and then moving that oil through Ukraine to get that in for use in Belarus. Sorry, I keep saying gas because we're talking about gas so much, but oil is where this geopolitical play is going on. At the same time, the U.S. has increased its own diplomatic engagement over the past several years with Minsk, and I think that's had major impact as well, both from an energy perspective and also just a political hedging perspective for the calculus in Minsk. So that's what's going on there. And then this price war via OPEC Plus, and with the idea that Moscow would be, quote, going after the U.S. Shale industry. I mean, I think we've seen pretty clearly how long that could go on, right? This idea from the Russian finance ministry that Moscow could use its foreign currency reserves that total roughly 570 billion, as well as its 150 billion national wealth fund, which, by the way, was a windfall that resulted from Russia's own hydrocarbon revenues following its 2016 OPEC Plus arrangement. This idea that it could basically subsidize its oil and gas industry to the tune of 1.7 billion per month. That's tough, especially in this period where you have humanitarian concerns, public health concerns, where you have these historic bailouts going on in other countries around the world. Russia's going to have to do very likely the same thing to become stabilized. And this idea that you would additionally throw on a couple $1 billion of subsidies is absurd. Now, obviously, even with the cuts of last week, this agreement that didn't really stabilize the markets, and we saw earlier this week, West Texas Intermediate trading significantly negative. So, and the Brent price also dropping significantly. So, this idea that this can be held on as a political energy weapon against the U.S. or against anyone worldwide is really comes into question, especially in the current environment, which is, to say the least, unprecedented.
Well, Benjamin, let's move to your personal and professional trajectory.
All right, play ball.
Yes, you have a fascinating background, which involves a lot of science and physics. And it seems you've been able to straddle two very different worlds, but at the same time that may connect. And you're going to explain us. So on the one hand, you have your eyes in the stars, literally, because you look through giant telescope to understand more about our universe, dark energy, and black holes and microwaves. And by the way, I had to Google a lot of this. And on the other hand, you seem more grounded to Earth and trying to make sense of today's geopolitics of energy and power competition. So what kind of similarities do you see in those two worlds? There might be more than meet the eye. And how in your brain do you jump from one world to the other? What kind of background did you get to do that?
Well, look, I've always enjoyed astronomy and astrophysics since I was very little. And, the first physics experience that I got was a high school program, which I just don't know of any program like this, even, across the United States, that allowed so I grew up in Rochester, New York, and there was a facility known as the Laboratory for Laser Energetics at the University of Rochester that's supported by the U.S. Department of Energy. That's an inertial confinement fusion facility. So what that does is it uses these sets of very large lasers to compress a very small target of cryogenically cooled deuterium, tritium, helium-3, etc., to do fusion research. So for energy, and also for supporting the nation's nuclear stockpile stewardship program. So that was something that I got exposed to very early, and as a result, I ended up going as an undergraduate to the University of Rochester and staying in that field, and so kind of got dragged away from my early interest in astronomy into doing this very what could be transformative work in physics that could support doing my very small part of that, of course, especially that early in my career as an undergraduate. But it was really inspiring that the impact that energy can have. And I remember at the time, in talks and in papers that would be written on this subject, there would always be kind of a throwaway line at the start and said, if fusion energy, and of course fusion, unlike fission, is a nuclear energy source that is sourced from light elements. Like basically, you can get this from refined seawater, for example, and then the output of the reaction does not have this large unstable radioactive waste. There just can't be this runaway chain, and if the reaction stops, it simply stops. This thermonuclear burn can't continue to propagate. But there'd always be a throwaway line where you'd have this notion that if we can get fusion to work, some variation of we can get fusion to work, it will have massive geopolitical impact on stabilizing energy security worldwide, and, et cetera, being a baseload. And I never really thought of that much at the time. Obviously, now in retrospect, that is hugely important as we try to move towards a zero carbon future, and get towards getting to sustain both renewables as we see them now, especially hydro, solar, and wind, the traditional ones, and have them supported by future grid scale battery storage. But at some point, having fusion will get us to that level where we will have that base load taken care of pretty stably.
Yeah, so it has the advantage. It has the advantage of being without carbon, little waste, but isn't it still very expensive and many years away commercialization?
Yeah, people always say, the old quote is, quote, fusion, the energy source of the future. ... And it will always. And there's a way to get by this, though. A robust, predictable, long-term federal funding environment for science would go a long way to countering this old joke. And you'd asked me when we talked before the podcast, about how does the U.S. stack up, historically in terms of its basic science investment. Right now, 10 countries spend more as a share of its GDP, as a percentage of their GDP, than the U.S. does, which currently we're spending 2.74% of our GDP on basic research. That was in 2018. In terms of overall spending, we still continue to be the envy of the world. We're one of the top. China is the only one that has outspent us by a few tens of billions of dollars. But in terms of physics, historically, there was this huge Cold War bubble in the 50s and 60s, where physics facilities and related applied science labs and engineering centers were built up. You had a lot of PhDs, being minted in that era in these hard sciences. And I think you see that there's a market drop, comparative drop in funding in the years since, the decades since, and you can kind of see it as a physical reminder. I've been at a number of institutions that this holds for. The academic buildings for physics, in particular on U.S. campuses, are really of that era. Many are built in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and you can see it. You can see that from the architectural styles. And there's just a handful that have been upgraded significantly or built new since, and that's telling. So that's something that we need to keep in mind when you look at fusion in particular. You kind of have two ways of doing this. You have laser-driven inertial confinement fusion, and that directly supports long-term R&D.
Laser-driven, and what's the other one?
So it's inertial confinement fusion. That's with lasers. The other one is called a tokamak. That's with magnets, big cryogenically cooled magnets.
What about ITER? I know ITER. What are they doing?
So I was just going to get to ITER. So ITER, that's kind of where you have that real diplomatic engagement and geopolitical connection to large-scale, fusion energy science. Reagan and Gorbachev signed this in 1985, the original agreement.
Just for a listener, Benjamin, it's the big project in south of France that shows cooperation between various members, including China, the US, some European countries, India. But so it shows international cooperation to some extent, but at the same time, many countries are looking into it at a national level too, right?
Yeah, and that's really what I mean. There's nine ITER members. I have them listed here actually. It's the European Union, India, Japan, Korea, Russian Federation. China is actually involved, and the United States. They all have an equal share, and it's a 35-year collaboration so far to build and operate this experimental device that could potentially in the future bridge us to something called demo that would be fusion in terms of creating power for the poor. But even on a no holds barred fast track, such as we saw during the Apollo program, it would still take at least 20 or 30 years to get us to the point where large scale investment in this can get to commercialization of fusion. So it's a long way off, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't be involved in that. And that's exactly the point. There's a lot of national security reasons on the inertial confinement fusion side, the laser driven fusion side. The goal of ignition science of developing self-sustained thermonuclear burning plasmas, or an ignition platform, and having a fusion yield is of direct importance to the U.S.'s own National Nuclear Stockpile Stewardship Program, because what that does for its thermonuclear, it's as a thermonuclear fusion plasma, high energy density physics plasma platform, it would allow, along with supercomputing, direct access to weapons relevant regimes and nuclear environments for the study of high yield weapons relevant conditions. And pursuing laboratory scale thermonuclear ignition is an important objective of the stewardship program, because we haven't had, for example, large scale nuclear detonation testing in this country for many, many decades. And that's because of these sort of programs. So, you had at the start of the Trump administration this kind of initial twofold approach where there was general discussion of cutting the fusion budget, basic research fusion budget in the U.S., where at the same time President Trump said, in a kind of a fleeting reference to nuclear weapons, let it be an arms race. So you kind of have these two avenues that really don't add up, and that's why you need scientists involved in national security policy directly and involved in foreign policy.
It's interesting because we see right now with COVID-19, there is a lot of competition between great powers regarding the science and the origins and the blame. So it's heartwarming in a way to see that there is still a lot of cooperation more on the astrology and physics, whether it's with the International Space Station or ITER or other projects where scientists manage to cooperate.
Absolutely. I mean, this just happened yesterday. It made headlines in the U.S., but this notion, of the president suggesting that you could inject bleach or have a high intensity UV source put in the human body to combat COVID-19. Not only is it absurd, it's dangerous. And this is why we need scientists involved at the highest levels and speaking at the highest levels. And I'm hopeful that future administrations will take that to heart. I'm concerned that the Trump administration simply will never get there. Yeah, it's important. But in the meantime, I'm focused on large scale astronomy infrastructure development. I did my PhD building telescopes looking at what's known as the cosmic microwave background. It's the oldest light in the universe, relic radiation from the Big Bang. And that was a telescope called the Atacama Cosmology Telescope in northern Chile. And now I'm here at Harvard working on a facility and trying to upgrade and build, help the team build new facilities at the South Pole with a project known as the Bicep Array Experiment. And actually was down in Antarctica at the start of this year. So I started off my social distancing early, I
Nice.
guess.
So what's going on in Antarctica those days? Because we hear a lot about the Arctics and competition between great power in the Arctics right now, notably Russia, China, very interested in the transportation routes too, and the potential natural resources over there. Do we see the same kind of interest in the South Pole, or it's not yet there?
Unfortunately, I mean, you're seeing trends, and this is completely separate from the scientific work that I've been engaged in with my team at the South Pole. When you step back and look at the geopolitical drivers, you're absolutely right. The Arctic has seen a much greater scramble for resources, scramble for influence. Russia and China have collaborated on the so-called Polar Silk Road that would allow for commercial shipping from mainland China over to, the transatlantic Arctic space. And that's due to global warming. That's due to our impact on melting ice in the Arctic space. But the global far south has not, unfortunately, been completely absent in this resource competition. Although the Antarctic Treaty System that was passed many decades ago, and then its provisions and protocols on environmental and resource exploitation in the global far south of 60 degrees south latitude, has held, and it will hold until hopefully until 2048 when it expires, and hopefully it will be extended at that point. But this year, so far, at the same time as the OPEC Plus crisis was going on, as the Turk Stream was coming online, as the Transneft cutoff of crude going to Belarus was happening, Rosgeologia, which is the state-owned geological surveyor agency in the Russian Federation, was engaged in 4,400 kilometers of seismic shooting, hydrocarbon resource exploration in the Ries-Larsen Sea off the coast of Antarctica. And that's really concerning from, in terms of a political precedent, because certainly even at our highest energy prices, several years ago, that would be not insufficient to make some sort of commercial operation in that region viable. And that's not to in any way endorse it. It certainly is a horrible idea from an environmental perspective. But even now, especially now, there's really no commercial drivers for that. That's more of in my view, a testing of international agreements and testing of the contours of international legal protocols that we've seen the Kremlin engage in, whether it be in the United Nations or other international organizations. That is more of a kind of not, unfortunately, engaging in a manner that helps solve global crises, but instead acts more as a global spoiler in many.
I have just a question here. What kind of hydrocarbon are they hoping to find? Because the world is already awash with oil and gas. Is it different mineral resources?
Well, there's a question. I'll set aside the question of critical minerals. That's separate from this. This particular action appeared to be from their own press statements on hydrocarbons, right? So we're talking about oil and gas, and it just doesn't make sense now. Not, of course, irresponsible from an environmental perspective in that region, but it doesn't make sense from pricing environment, even when we were at plus over $100 a barrel oil, to make that sort of investment in have the supply chains go that far south. Not to mention that it would have significant environmental impact, challenge the Antarctic Treaty System. So I think that at the end of the day, what you're seeing here is less of a commercial driver and more of what Russia has been seen to do in other international organizations and other international treaties, which is kind of test the boundaries. They've seen this at the UN and elsewhere. And instead of, being part of that system, global system to meet challenges, again, in this, unfortunately, it appears that at least from its outward appearance to be kind of acting as a global spoiler, as we've seen in many other.
Yeah, very interesting. So how was it to go to Antarctica? It's most of the time nighttime, I mean, right? And winter?
It was great. So I actually went down there in summer. So it's swapped. So the austral summer, I went down for about 5.5 weeks in January, starting in early January. And it was fantastic. It was a once in a lifetime opportunity. You fly all the way flying from Boston to San Francisco to Auckland to Christchurch, New Zealand, and that's all on commercial airlines. Then you switch to U.S. Air Force, which supports flights down to the ice itself. My home state's New York Air National Guard is leading that effort. And you get on what's known as a LC-130, which is a specialized skied version of a C-130 military cargo aircraft, and that allows the planes to take off from Christchurch and then 8 hours later land on the ice in outside of McMurdo Station in Antarctica. And then you basically still have to get to the South Pole, transit McMurdo, get back on an LC-130 and fly another 2.5 to 3.5 hours to get to the South Pole itself, which is, when you step out, a very otherworldly, and kind of pinch yourself and you look around and
Wow.
see this icy plain in all directions, aside from our telescope facility, a number of other science facilities, and then the station itself, which is all sitting in specially designed buildings that sit on these stilts on the ice itself.
What did you bring in your suitcase?
A lot. I brought a lot. I brought a lot of gear that I had. Some of it left over from my days working in the Atacama Desert in northern Chile. But thankfully, the U.S. Antarctic program gives you all of your what they call extreme cold weather gear, right? So from your jacket to your snow pants and everything, and boots and things like that, everything rated for extreme cold weather environments. And it was when we were outside down there that got, in the summertime when it's always daylight, we were hovering in the minus 40 to minus 50 range, with the highs in the minus 30s.
Wow.
So it was cold, and of course that was just a short visit for me. We have real heroes that are down there, right now. There are winter rovers where you have, in this case, we have 2 telescopes operating, and we have 2 winter rovers. They are site engineers that are keeping the lights on and keeping the telescope running as we go through the winter, because during that 9-month period between about mid-March and late October, these military aircraft, they just can't fly down there and land easily because it's so cold. You're at minus 90. So that fuel itself in the lines would freeze, the jet fuel, kind of become a jelly, so it doesn't become very efficient, or you couldn't take off again. So they're stuck there. That's the bad news. The good news is this particular year, they're as socially isolated as they can be, and thank God there's no COVID-19 down there right now on the ice. And so I'm kind of kicking myself. This is, as many of my colleagues are, this is the one year that would have been, I guess, great to volunteer to do that job. But I can't say enough about the rest of the work the rest of the team does, both here in North America, and then of course our folks that are continuously down at the South Pole.
Well, Benjamin, I still have so many questions, but we have to leave it there. Thank you very much to share your scientist view with us. I mean, I think you didn't really answer my question, but I definitely, I'm sure you bring a different perspective just because of your lenses, scientist lenses, to the European energy security analysis and geopolitics of energy. So thank you for sharing this with us.
Thanks so much, Leslie. And I guess I could just leave you with this thought: the overlap is actually larger than one might think, because a lot of the large scale science infrastructure that I've mentioned, whether it be a fusion facility, whether it be a large scale telescope, those are in the tens of millions of dollars, $billion range for some of those facilities. But their development path really reflects kind of the technology development and facility development you see in the energy sector that are just scaled up in terms of cost and scale, potentially, physical scale. And so I think you bring a lot of those overlaps, those hard science and technology, engineering sort of perspectives into policy. It allows for much more tailored policy solutions, that are giving options to the United States, its partners and its allies, that are calibrated to, minimize diplomatic fallout while maximizing the national security impact that we're hoping for. So I just think that I can't say enough about the work and involving scientists in the federal policy enterprise and national security enterprise, and I just this is kind of my normal call out to other scientists to get involved. Just try to be involved in the process. We're all on this this boat together, and the more that we can support it, the better.
Perfect. Very good way to end. Thank you so much, Benjamin. Talk to you soon.
Thanks a lot, Leslie. Thanks for having me on.
That concludes our Energy Vista podcast, which was recorded on April 24, 2020. This is Leslie Palti-Guzman saying good day and good luck.